The law has outgrown its primitive stage of formalism when the precise words was the sovereign's talisman, and every slip was fatal. It takes a broader view today. A promise may be lacking, and yet the whole writing may be instinct with an obligation imperfectly expressed. The concept of consideration is firmly embedded in the law of contracts. To be enforceable, a contract must be supported by consideration, which is broadly defined as something of legal value. Consideration consists of money, property, the provisions of service or services, the forbearance of a right, or anything else of value. Most contracts that are not supported by consideration are not enforceable. However, the parties may voluntarily perform a contract that is lacking in consideration. This chapter discusses consideration, promises that lack consideration, and promises that are enforceable without consideration. Consideration, something of legal value given in exchange for a promise. Consideration is a necessary element for the existence of a contract. Consideration is defined as a thing of value given in exchange for a promise. Consideration can come in many forms. The most common types consist of either a tangible payment, ergo money or property, or the performance of an act, ergo providing legal services. Less usual forms of consideration include the forbearance of a legal right, ergo accepting an out-of-court settlement in exchange for dropping a lawsuit. A non-economic forms of consideration, ergo refraining from drinking, using tobacco, swearing, or playing cards or billiards for money for a specified time period. Written contracts are presumed to be supported by consideration. This is rebuttable presumption because it's just prima facie evidence of a contract or the existence of a contract. Remember, an agreement is not necessarily a contract, ladies and gentlemen, but it is a rebuttable presumption that a contract exists when it is in writing. That may be overcome by sufficient evidence. A few states provide that contracts made under seal cannot be challenged for lack of consideration. Consideration consists of two elements. One, something of legal value must be given, ergo, either a legal benefit must be received or a legal detriment suffered. And two, there must be a bargained for exchange. Each of these is discussed in the paragraphs that follow. Legal value. Something of legal value must be given. Under the modern law of contracts, a contract is considered supported by legal value if 1. The promisee suffers a legal detriment, or 2. The promisor receives a legal benefit. Consider this example. Suppose the Dallas Cowboys contracts with a tailor to have uniforms made for the team. The tailor completes the uniforms, but the team manager thinks the color is wrong and refuses to allow the team to wear them. Here, there has been no benefit to either the manager or the players. However, the tailor has suffered a legal detriment, time spent making the uniforms. Again, your valued precious time commodity holds value. Under the modern rule of contracts, there is sufficiency of consideration and the contract is enforceable. In the following case, the court had to determine whether a contract was supported by consideration. Note, the more formal approach to finding consideration has been replaced by a modern definition that considers a contract supported by consideration if either 1. The promisee suffers a legal detriment, or 2. The promisor receives a legal benefit. Bargained for exchanged. Bargained for exchange. Exchange that parties engage in that leads to an enforceable contract. Bargained for exchange. To be enforceable, a contract must arise from a bargained for exchange. In most business contracts, the parties engage in such exchanges. The commercial setting in which business contracts are formed leads to this conclusion. Gift promise, an unenforceable promise because it lacks consideration. Gift promise, also called gratuitous promise, are unenforceable because they lack consideration. To change a gift promise into an enforceable promise, the promisee must offer to do something in exchange, that is, consideration for a promise. Note, a complete gift promise becomes a true gift, which by definition is irrevocable. Consider this example. Suppose Miss Colby promised to give her son $10,000 and then rescinded that promise. The son would have no recourse because it was a gift for getting an A in his business law course, and the son performed as required. The contract would be enforceable. A completed gift promise cannot be rescinded for lack of consideration. Nominal consideration. Historically, the problem of lack of consideration associated with gift promises was avoided by naming a low dollar amount, such as $1, as consideration for the contract. Such consideration is referred to as nominal consideration. Nominal consideration is not considered legally sufficient in states that recognize the conscience of the court standard for examining the adequacy of consideration discussed in the following. Special issue concerning consideration in business contracts. Generally, the courts tolerate a greater degree of uncertainty in business contracts than in personal contracts under the premise that sophisticated parties know how to protect themselves when negotiating contracts. The following special types of business contracts that specifically allow a greater degree of uncertainty concerning consideration. Option to cancel clause. A clause inserted in many business contracts that allows one or both of the parties to cancel the contract. Option to cancel clause. Many business contracts contain clauses that allow one or both of the parties to cancel the contract. Such option to cancel clause do not render a business contract illusory if a party to the contract has given legal consideration for the right to cancel. Consider this example. Suppose an employer contracts to hire a personal manager for 3 years. The parties sign a written contract that contains an option to cancel clause that gives the employer the right to terminate the manager upon a 30-day paid notice. This clause is enforceable because it is supported by consideration, ergo, the notice period. Best efforts contract. Many business contracts contain a clause that requires one or both parties to use their best efforts to achieve the objective of the contract. For example, real estate listing contracts often require a real estate broker to use his or her best efforts to find a buyer for the listed real estate. Contracts often require underwriters to use their best efforts to sell securities on behalf of their corporate clients. The courts generally have held that the imposition of the best efforts duty provides sufficient consideration to make a contract enforceable. Contracts lacking consideration. Some contracts seem as though they are supported by consideration, even though they are not. The following types of contracts fall into this category. Illegal consideration, a promise to refrain from doing an illegal act, such a promise will not support a contract. Illegal consideration. A contract cannot be supported by a promise to refrain from doing an illegal act because that is illegal consideration. Contracts based on illegal consideration are void, not voidable, but void. For example, statements such as, "I will burn your house down unless you agree to pay me $10,000 cannot become enforceable contracts. Even if the threatened party agrees to make the payment, the contract is unenforceable and void because it is supported by illegal consideration. Arson is unlawful. Arson happens to also be illegal. When legal and lawful agree and are in harmony, I'm in agreement with what is legal and what is lawful." Illusory promise. Illusory promise, a contract into which parties enter, but one or both of the parties can choose not to perform their contractual obligations. Thus, the contract lacks consideration. Caution. Promises made out of the sense of moral obligation lack consideration. Such promises are unenforceable in most states. Illusory promise. If the parties enter into a contract, but one or both of the parties can choose not to perform their contractual obligations, the contract lacks consideration. Such promises, which are known as illusory promises or illusory contracts, are unenforceable. For example, a contract that provides that one of the parties only has to perform if he or she chooses to do so is an illusory contract. Moral obligation. Promises made out of a sense of moral obligation or honor are generally unenforceable on the grounds that they lack consideration. In other words, moral consideration is not treated as legal consideration. Contracts based on love and affection and deathbed promises are examples of such promises. A minority of state holds that moral obligations are enforceable. Pre-existing duty. Pre-existing duty. A promise lacks consideration if a person promises to perform an act or do something he or she is already under an obligation to do. Business brief. If a party runs into substantial unforeseen difficulties while performing his or her contract duties, the contract can be modified without new consideration being given. Pre-existing duty. A promise lacks consideration if a person promises to perform an act or to do something he or she is already under an obligation to do. This is called pre-existing duty. The promise is unenforceable because no new consideration has been given. For example, many states have adopted statutes that prohibit police officers from accepting rewards for apprehending criminals. In the private sector, the pre-existing duty rule often arises when one of the parties to an existing contract seeks to change the terms of the contract during the course of its performance. Such midstream changes are unenforceable. The parties have a pre-existing duty to perform according to the original terms of the contract. Sometimes a party to a contract runs into substantial unforeseen difficulties while performing his or her contractual duties. If the parties modify their contract to accommodate these unforeseen difficulties, the modification will be enforced even though it is not supported by new consideration. Consider this example. Suppose a landowner enters into a contract with a contractor who agrees to excavate the hole for the foundation of a major office building. When the excavation is partially completed, toxic water are unexpectedly found at the site. Removal of toxic waste is highly regulated by law and would substantially increase the cost of the excavation. If the landowner agrees to pay the contractor increased compensation to remove the toxic waste, this modification of the contract is enforceable even though it is unsupported by new consideration. Past consideration. In a business setting, problems of past consideration often arise when a party to a contract promises to pay additional compensation for work done in the past. Past consideration. A prior act or performance past consideration, ergo prior acts, will not support a new contract. New consideration must be given. For example, consider this example. Felipe Chavez, who has worked for the ACE Corporation for 30 years, is retiring. The president of ACE says, because you were such a loyal employee, ACE will pay you a bonus of $25,000. The corporation refuses to pay the $25,000. Unfortunately, Mr. Chavez, the contract is unenforceable because it is based on past consideration. Settlement of claims. The law promotes the voluntary settlement of dispute claims. Settlement saves judicial resources and serves the interest of the parties entering into the settlement. The most common forms of settlement agreements are discussed in the paragraphs that follow. In some situations, one of the parties to a contract believes that he or she did not receive what he or she was due. This party may attempt to reach a compromise with the other party, ergo by paying less consideration than was provided for in the contract. The compromise agreement is called an accord. If the accord is performed, it is called the satisfaction. This type of settlement is called accord and satisfaction, or a compromise. If the accord is not satisfied, the other party can sue to enforce either the accord or the original contract. The issue of whether an accord and satisfaction require additional consideration to be enforceable depends on whether the debt is liquidated or unliquidated. Consider the example. Suppose that a contract stipulated that the cost of a computer system that keeps track of inventory, accounts receivable, and so on is $100,000. After it is installed, the computer system does not perform as promised. To settle the dispute, the parties agree that $70,000 is to be paid in full and final payment for the computer. This accord is enforceable even though there is no new consideration is given, because reasonable persons would differ as to the worth of the computer system that actually was installed. Promissory estoppel. The courts have developed the doctrine of promissory estoppel, detrimental reliance, to avoid injustice. This is a broad policy-based doctrine. It is used to provide a remedy to a person who has relied on another person's promise, but that person withdraws his or her promise and is not subject to a breach of contract action because one of the two elements discussed in this chapter, i.e., agreement or consideration, is lacking. The doctrine of promissory estoppel prevents the promisor from revoking his or her promise. Therefore, the person who has detrimentally relied on the promise for the performance may sue the promisor for performance or other remedy the court feels is fair to award in the circumstances. For the doctrine of promissory estoppel to be applied, the following elements must be shown. Not maybe, not shall, not might. The following elements must be shown. Number one, the promisor made a promise. Number two, promisor should have reasonably expected to induce the promise to rely on the promise. And number three, promisee actually relied on the promise and engaged in an action or forbearance of a right of a definite and substantial nature. And number four, injustice would be caused if the promise were not enforced. Consider this example. XYZ Construction Company, a general contractor, requests bids from subcontractors for work to be done on a hospital building that XYZ plans to submit a bid to build. Burt Plumbing Co. submits the lowest bid for the plumbing work, and XYZ incorporates Brett's low bid in its own bid for the general contract. In this example, the doctrine of promissory estoppel prevents Burt from withdrawing its bid. If XYZ is awarded the contract to build the hospital, it could enforce Burt's promise to perform. Promissory estoppel, an equitable doctrine that prevents the withdrawal of a promise by the promisor if it will adversely affect a promisee who has adjusted his or her position in justifiable reliance on the promise. Now, equity is no part of the law, but a moral virtue which qualifies, moderates, and reforms the rigor, hardness, and edge of the law, and is an universal truth.